Welcome back to Light Talk, where everyday people can share their spiritual journey stories with a safe and supportive community. If you want to be a guest on the show, please email lighttalk423@gmail.com. And while you're at it, click on your like, subscribe, and share buttons. Well, we're going to jump right in here. So go ahead and introduce yourself and we'll get going on our stories.
Of course. So my name is Ben Stimson. I'm a pagan author, therapist, and folklorist student up here in Canada. I'm originally from the United Kingdom. I just recently came out with my first book through Llewellyn called Ancestral Whispers, a guide to ancestral veneration practices. So I come from a very diverse background of things. Most mental health oriented in my professional life, and then in my fun kind of extracurricular life, really focus on history and medieval studies and folklore. So originally from the UK, as I said, I came over to Canada when I was 8 years old. And I've lived here ever since. I'm planning on moving back to the UK. And so talks like this actually get me hyped up for that again. So yeah, that's who I am.
All right. I thank you so much for being on the show. And I'm excited to hear all your stories.
Mhm.
Yes. So,
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, where would you like to begin?
well, let's start with your UK house.
Yeah, for sure. So the area I was born in the UK, it's called St Asaph in North Wales. And North Wales is a very, very old country, even by UK standards. Wales is really the land of the ancient British people. Most of the language spoken there, the Welsh language there, goes right back almost 2,000 years. And it's kind of a strange kind of area because it's very depopulated by standards of England. England has about 60 million, no, about 40 million people, I should say, and Wales has only 5 million people. Really, really distinct kind of geography too. You have a lot more mountains in Wales as opposed to England, which tends to be a lot more flatter. And Wales, the mountains in Wales are the same ancient mountain chain as the Highlands of Scotland, the Atlas Mountains in North Africa, and Appalachia. So Appalachia and going all the way up to Nova Scotia and Newfoundland was at one point connected to the Highlands of Scotland and Wales. So it's kind of a very old landscape. It's got a very old geography. And many of the houses there are very, very old. So I know in the United States and Canada here, you're looking at about 300, maybe 400 years for most of the older places that are not indigenous in nature.
Mhm.
In the UK, you can have buildings that are perhaps 500, 600, even 1,000 years old, and they're just
Oh.
regular parts of the community. I know
Yeah,
it's kind
that's
of a weird thing to think about,
yeah, it's hard to kind of think about something like that. It's just
right? And even then,
oh,
most of the
time.
even like the houses that are like 200 or 300 years old, they're usually the way that they would have evolved and built, they would have built on top of the older structures. So you may have a house that's only 200 years old, but parts of it and buried inside it is a house that might be 3 or 4 or 5 or 600 years old. So very
Wow.
old structures.
Yeah.
And that's why we tend to find a lot of them being haunted. So the little area that I lived for until I was 8 before we moved over to Canada, it was kind of at the foot of a little mountain chain. And when I say mountain chain, I don't mean like the Rockies. I mean more rolling hills, but for us, they're mountains, right?
Yeah, a little different.
Right. Yeah. And it was just down the road from my parents' pub. My parents were publicans. They moved from England to Wales before I was born, and they took up a place in an old stagecoach pub. And like when I say pub, like think of the old-fashioned style pubs, and that was about 300 years old. And I remember weird encounters when I was a kid there. There were the whole landscape is just animate with spirit and animate with all sorts of other beings. At any moment, you might be wandering through a field, and at any moment, something might be coming around the corner to you. or every hill or every mountain might have a giant that peaks over it, right? And we see this in the folklore. The folklore is rich, and that folkloric heritage is a part of America's heritage. Many of the older settled parts of the Eastern Seaboard, and Appalachians particularly, tends to share a lot of that folkloric history and story. So the wee folk, the good people, the fairies, a lot of the stories told in Appalachia and parts of New England are very similar to what you find in Wales, Scotland, and Ireland. Totally makes sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when I was a kid, I was born with I'm neurodiverse. I was born with a condition called dyspraxia, which affected my ability to speak. I had to go through extensive speech therapy when I was a kid. So oftentimes I was mumbling and I wasn't able to form words, but I could understand perfectly. And I found that oftentimes I would meet people in the garden, or down the lane who would completely understand me, and at that point in my life, like, it wasn't possible for them to understand me because I was like I couldn't speak, right?
Oh, yeah.
But these little people, they weren't they weren't tiny like the Victorian style of fairy. They were modicum height. They were smaller, but they weren't, that small. And they would wear very similar clothing to kind of what you would imagine like Victorian era people, like
Okay.
tweed and a lot of like jackets and waistcoats and things like that. And they would look just like country people, right? And I remember once I was playing in the garden of my family's cottage, which was just down the road from their pub. They bought this place, renovated it, and flipped it in order to raise money to come over
Mm-hmm.
here. And I was in the garden, and I was just playing, doing whatever. And this little man came up to me and he said, "What are you doing down there?" And he had a thick Welsh accent, and the Welsh accent is very sing-songy, very like, "Oh, what are you doing down there?" And so I said to him, "I'm just playing." He said, "Well, you be careful, don't make any mess." And then he literally just went and walked straight into the hedge, and it was just normal, right? It was just weird.
Okay.
Like, I wasn't scared. It wasn't abnormal. I'd seen people coming in and out of the hedge all the time. Like, it was just a
Just
normal part
normal.
of.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Huh.
So that house itself it was a weird place because it had been built onto over so many centuries. So the original structure was about 300 years old. And then there was a big renovation done at the turn of the 20th century, and then we added on to it. So it's kind of a mishmash of extensions. Um, it was very interesting. Yeah, it was
Yeah,
really.
I'm kind of picturing this house. It's kind of
Mhm.
okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, Over there, planning permission is really difficult, or was really difficult to get. You had to be very like cautious, even out in the country. And so extensions were only small little things. But if you extended enough, and they got enough extensions, you could then knock through walls, and then you'd have a bigger extension. So it was kind of a neat thing, and it was such a strange little plot of land too, because we were literally just at the start of the laneway that went down to our neighbors, but it was a good 5 minute walk to the neighbors, so we were relatively
Oh,
isolated there.
yeah.
And mountains all around. um, and like, I remember there was always a feeling in certain parts of the house of either this was a very, like, this was a safe place to be, this was a comfortable place, or this was a place that you don't go to because it feels cold. um,
Oh, wow.
I when I was very young, I encountered, it's called the entity, the hag, and I would often encounter the hag. I would have hag attacks. And have you ever heard of these before?
Yeah, I have. Not very much, but I have heard of them.
Hmm.
And
This,
they have like a hunchback, or and have like a pointed hat or something like that.
well,
Just
so
kind of
so
smaller.
yeah, it's kind
Yeah.
of elongated and whatnot. Yeah, I was
Okay.
about four, maybe 4 or 5, probably about 4 or 5 when I had my first attack. And I mean, modern science would say that it's just sleep paralysis. It's just a misalignment between kind of your body as it's falling asleep and shutting down, and then another part of your brain that's still active. But it felt very real to me. And where I was, I had my own bedroom at the time, and my bunk bed was behind the door, so the door going out of my bedroom into the hallway,
Okay.
and then the back of the door would go against the back of my bunk bed. So I was raised up, and then the rest of the room would of course be dark. And it was
Okay.
one of those weird slanted rooms. And I would always get this weird feeling of shock um, when I was about to be visited by this thing, like almost like when you can hear your heartbeat in your ear and you just go clammy and you just go into a sense of shock. I would start to feel that,
Oh,
and then I
wow.
would see this being come around the corner and stare at me. And at that time, the bunk bed was like raised up, so it was like literally staring at me in my face. And it was this. I used to call her the black woman, the black lady. It was a female figure, long fingers, and a completely black head to toe. And I would hear like weird music, and then that would be it. Like she would reach out and touch me with one of these fingers, and then I would wake up, like wake up in the morning and I'd be fine. But what was weird was my sister, who was a little older than me at the time. She was 13, 14 at the time when I was 4 or 5. She would often say she would come into my bedroom in the morning to either wake me up or to get like linen, because my bedroom was a linen closet as well. It was just one of those things, small house, you
Yeah.
keep things in it.
It's all good.
It's just what you do, right?
It's just what you
So
do sometimes.
it's
Yeah.
just what you do, right? And she would
Right.
say that I would have my eyes open. I'd be sleeping, but my eyes would be open, which is a very strange thing. Very strange thing. So I only ever encountered her in that house. I never encountered her when we moved to Canada or anything like that. So I do believe that she was attached to that house. And in folklore, we have all of these beings called bogies or boggarts, and they often appeared as like house spirits connected to a particular house, and they that was their job, that was their role, that's what they did. They terrorized the kids. So I do believe that we had a boggart or a bogey attached to that house. Mhm.
Wow. So they would just terrorize the kids and just and the parents wouldn't know anything about it, so they just focused on the
Yeah, this is the thing.
children.
This is what I found. So when I was younger, I would often try to talk to my parents about some of these encounters, right?
Hmm.
And it was almost as if it was almost like just a lens went over, like film went over their face, and they just weren't listening. And it's an interesting thing when you exist in a house that's haunted. Oftentimes, what you do is you filter it out because the way that the uncanny happens, it just doesn't make rational sense, and so the brain naturally just filters it out. So people
Oh,
can be living in a haunted space and weird things can be going on, but it just becomes so normal to you that it just is blank, right?
oh,
Um,
okay.
when we moved
Okay.
over to Canada, my parents they took on a brewery, an old brewery building in Ontario here, and the building itself was 175 years old. Now the space was like 20,000 square feet, but it was an old stone building. It was field stone. It had been designed by local stonemasons, and huge parts of it were uninhabitable. It was just like a big barn in one part. But underneath there was like a sunken level that at one point you could go down into and go out the back and go outside, but the whole back end had been backfilled and raised up so that it
Oh,
was now
wow.
fully underground. And I swear, like, so we had encounters in that building, um, and but they were good encounters. Like the owners, I do believe that it was haunted, but the original owners, the person who founded the building in the first place, I think he was pleased that the building was being used for its purpose again.
Oh, I
And
bet
my
he
parents,
was.
like, yeah, it was a good feeling. My parents, they named a couple of the beers after his family or after his brews,
Oh,
so
I
very
bet you.
respectful.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's very awesome.
yeah,
Yeah, I bet he
yeah,
was thrilled about that.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was a wonderful feeling. And you know when you enter a space when you're welcome or not welcome, right? And I think that when we entered that space, it felt like home. Like my dad and my mom, they did a huge amount of work renovating it. It felt really cold when we first bought it. because it was a shell. It had been laying like for 20 years and was just used by the local town as like events every so often. But when they actually started producing beer, it felt like home. And
Oh.
but like we had weird stuff going on. Like there was a woman who was living with us who from the UK. She was working for my parents at the time. She lived with us for about 5 or 6 years, something like that. And she said one morning she woke up and it was like middle of the night, and she looked at her alarm clock. It was an electric alarm clock, and it ticked backwards, like it was ticking backwards. And
Huh.
so she was like, "What?" And she looked at it the next morning. It was weird, you know. Yeah.
Was it? Did it ever go back to the correct
Oh
time?
yeah, the next day it was fine.
It
So
was just
she just
fine.
pegged it as like, oh, I must have been dreaming or something like that. But she swore she was awake, right? Another cool thing with the building was because of the boiler, and because of the tanks and the various like the brewing system,
Hmm.
it created a lot of white noise. So a lot of like background white noise, like steam and boiler, like sounds, right?
Right.
And you could, if you listened carefully enough, you could almost hear like people were mumbling or talking to each other, right?
Yeah, I've had that happen when I
You've
was
had that.
driving. I
Yeah.
had no radio on or anything, but it sounded like a very distant chattering, like
Yeah,
the
like
radio was
people were
on or
talking
something.
behind a wall or something.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah, I've had that
yeah.
one.
It's interesting. I often encountered that. It was almost like somebody was just in another room and they were like, and you could tell by the tone they were just chatting.
Yeah,
It was
yeah,
something. Yeah.
yeah, that's what I
But
had, yeah.
yeah,
Woo.
I also having. Sorry, go on.
Oh no, I was just, that's what I had. It's like, yay.
Mhm. Now, whether or not, again, bringing skepticism in here, but whether or not that is just the mind kind of putting things together because there's a sound that it doesn't know what to do with, so it's creating this sense that the people must be talking, or if it's a real thing, I believe that it was a real thing that I was hearing, mainly because of some of the other experiences I had in that building. Like, I
Yeah,
remember once, I often used to get this where when I was just falling asleep, like I was really, really like in a good state and it was just comfortable. I could feel almost like myself was above myself. Like I got this sense of, when you're sitting in your body, when you're feeling yourself, you have this sense that you are here and you can
right,
direct your attention to certain parts of the body and you're here or you're there or whatever. You've got you're in your body.
right.
I often felt like I was just above my head, like somewhere just above my head here. And it was almost like I was listening to a radio station, something just like I would just hear chatter. Um, and it was a weird like thing, when you're like again listening to a radio station, you just get those every so often that those words in static.
Yeah.
It sounded like that, and it's something I often experience. Um, so again, very, very strange.
Yeah, and I asked my friend about that because a psychic friend of mine, and
Mhm.
he's like, "Yeah, you were probably just at that point where they were trying to communicate, and you were hearing just a bunch of them trying to get to me, trying to
Yes.
talk to me." And it's like because I had no radio, I even looked down to make sure my radio was off,
Right.
and it was like, yeah, and it's outside my car, which
Ah,
was kind
yes,
of weird.
yes.
It was like just outside my car, but
Interesting,
staying with
right?
me as I was driving. It was weird.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It almost sounds like if anyone has ever played like with those ghost boxes, the white noise boxes,
Uh huh.
every so often like a word will just pop up in the yellow, white, things like that.
Yeah.
It sounded similar to that. Yeah,
Kind of. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
You couldn't hear any real words, just
Mhm.
knowing that there was at least a few people over there talking.
Something.
There's, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So, you had that one, and then you have, do you have more on the little people?
Absolutely. So in in Wales, we call them the Tylwyth Teg, the little people, or the Plantanoon, so the children of the underworld. And actually, a friend of mine is just coming out with a book on Welsh fairies, particularly little people over there. It's not like the Victorian era where they're little tiny little winged creatures. Oftentimes they will appear as full-grown adults or slightly smaller, enough that they are otherworldly. And uh, often like meeting them, like the people who lived in the hedge, just kind of doing their thing and roaming around, kind of ignoring us, you know. But I do remember there was I got into my head when I was very small that whenever I got into the bath and was having a bath, there were little imps that were sitting on the windowsill, and they were playing a game to switch from one side to the other and to see if they could do it without me seeing them. So I'd be constantly like checking to see if they were there, right? So it's
Yeah.
very interesting. And the field just across from us, there was a little tiny little shrub right in the middle of it. Now, if any of you ever go over to Ireland or to Scotland, particularly England, you don't see this as much. Wales, you tend to see this a little bit, but what we had one in our field. What they're called are fairy forts, and so these are like solitary places that are understood to be inhabited by fairies. You go to Iceland, I should say, you'll often find like particular boulders where the road just kind of cuts around a big boulder, and that's because there are fairy folk or holder folk living under them. And I'm very sure that we had a group of fairies living in this, because every so often it was kind of a weird thing. We had the field had that, but it also had a power line running through it, like one of those big, massive power lines.
Uh-huh.
And that was often it would often be struck by lightning, just because it was the biggest thing in the whole area, apart from the
Right.
mountains. And every so often, you would see little sparks in this little tree. And I mean, my parents swear that no, no, it's just your imagination. But you would see kind of on a stormy day, little sparks, like little lights, just in this little tree. And again, I swear they were related to the people who lived in the hedge, and they were just a normal part of the like they were just normal. Now, whether or not I would have seen it as just normal when I was a teenager living in that house, I never got that chance. But it was just one of those things. We left when I was very very small, like I was 8 when I left, so
Oh
I
yeah.
didn't get a chance to really, yeah. But yeah, lots
Uh,
of things happen.
to really get curious and go visit and check it out.
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. I'm just so intrigued with all of this stuff that I've had a lot of stories, but some of those kind of things I haven't had, but it's so intriguing. It's just
Mhm.
kind of why I started this in a way. It's
Mhm.
just to hear everyone's stories. It's just so amazing. You guys'
Yeah.
stories are just, and everyone has a little different story to it too. And that's just so cool.
It's one of those things. So one of my major interests, again, folklore, but also lived folk legend, and the reality of these stories, the reality of these beings is that they're actually found across Europe. When you look at generally at folklore and folk culture, you find stories of spirits, of house spirits, of land spirits, of deities, of all sorts, for supernatural in general,
Right.
and they're everywhere. Now, we often, I think because of the stories that we have available, many of them are set like 200, 300 years ago. But when you look at urban legend, this is a really cool thing. Urban legend is the folklore of now that people will be regarding it in the future, right? So when you think of alien abductions, or when you think of, uncanny encounters, um, that body of experiences match and mirror the the stories that we have in the folklore. Close
Yeah.
by to where I came from, I came from a place called Kerwis, and just further down from there was a little place called Murkion, just over the hill. And close by to there was a farm that one of my absolute favorite and uncanny stories comes from. This farm, off in the middle of nowhere, it was about maybe a 10-minute walk, 20-minute walk outside the village. And it was a bunch of school children back in the late 1800s. And they reported going to one of their fields, and inside their field was a bunch of smaller statured people. They weren't tiny; they were smaller, so they
Smaller.
may have been like 4 or 5 feet tall. That's it, right? Very small.
Mm-hmm.
And they were dressed very strangely, almost like they were Morris dancing, and they were dancing. And then they saw that they were being spied upon, and they gave chase. And the description in the folklore record that we have is that these kids were running for their dear life because these creatures, these beings, these were just constantly at them, and they were fairies. But when you hear about their description, they were yellow skinned, like golden yellow skinned,
Oh, wow.
right? How oftentimes do we have stories of aliens where they are golden skinned or
Golden
gray
skinned.
or green goldeny skin, right? So
Yeah.
it's an interesting thing. It's a really interesting thing.
Yeah. Well, that's so awesome. You have just so many cool stories here.
Thank you.
And yeah, and our time's just about up, but I
Yes.
just wanted, yeah. And this is the worst part about this is,
Mhm.
the time. So maybe someday I'll get it to go longer. But yeah, so, I want to thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
joining me and taking your time out with me and to hear your stories. I just love it.
Absolutely, it was my
I
pleasure, and
love it.
nice to be on your show. And I hope that your other interviews go very well.
Oh, I hope so too. All right. Well, thank you very much,
Thank
and
you.
we will hopefully chat with you again sometime.
Absolutely, I'd be more than welcome to come back, or more than pleased to come back.
Oh, yeah. Well,
Mhm.
we'll make sure we get that done. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.